people want to have a seat, and even if you're sitting at the edges, please feel free to pull up to the round table and to fill in the empty seats. Love to have everyone sitting literally around the table. So we're going to start here in just about 1 minute, and just want to make sure everyone in the tech booth, etc., is set. We have 2 online participants that I'll be introducing shortly as well. Hello, good afternoon, and we're very pleased to welcome all of you to the discussion, Are We Serious About Leaving No One Behind? Building on 25 years of partnerships and putting mine survivors at center stage. My name is Jared Block. I'm with the International Campaign to Ban Landmines and Cluster Munition Coalition, and I'll be moderating the conversation this afternoon. We're honored to have with us today to provide opening remarks Thomas Fetz, Deputy Permanent Representative of Canada to the Conference on Disarmament, to my left. Nora Quintero, Minister Plenipotentiary from the Permanent Mission of Colombia, and Representative of Germany to the Conference on Disarmament, Ambassador Thomas Goebbels. Canada has long been a champion of the Mine Ban Treaty since it was adopted some 25 years ago in Ottawa, Canada. Colombia has contributed importantly through its leadership under the current treaty presidency and as host of the second review conference in Cartagena. Long-standing treaty champion Germany is the single largest mine action contributor to the Mine Ban Treaty. Adoption of the treaty was achieved through the combined perseverance and commitment of non-governmental organizations and survivor networks, together with governments, the International Committee of the Red Cross, and United Nations agencies. Today, the Mine Ban Treaty is one of the most adhered to and successful disarmament treaties ever, with hundreds of thousands of lives saved, without exaggeration, and untold landmine tragedies prevented. Yet the Ottawa process itself created a watershed model for humanitarian disarmament and peace building, with even wider repercussions for assistance to victims and ensuring the rights and needs of survivors and impacted communities. That is as valid and prescient today as it was in 1997. 30 years after the civil society coalition that is the International Campaign to Ban Landmines was founded, and 25 years after the Mine Ban Treaty adoption, we're at another crossroads in the fight to eliminate suffering from indiscriminate landmines. The number of casualties, the number of casualties has increased dramatically and remained disturbingly high over the past 10 years. We're also faced with the acute and growing impact of improvised mines, or IEDs. New conflicts are leaving a trail of deadly mine legacies, the scale of which will only be known when the fighting ends, while emerging humanitarian crises are demanding ever greater resources and attention from Mine Ban Treaty states and other states as well. As we approach the aspirational target of a mine-free 2025, it appears there's a serious need to convene or reconvene and reinvigorate the collaborative partnerships that led to the creation of the Mine Ban Treaty. We need to take account of the past 25 years of learning and successes, as well as new frameworks for development. Human security and sustainable mine action in the face of new and emerging challenges, to eliminating landmines and creating communities free from landmine tragedies. So with this in mind, we're very pleased to be able to convene the esteemed expertise here today in the room, as well as our partners who are not in the room, but with us today in the discussion. Hopefully this will be the first of many such discussions on seeking solutions to these barriers on the road to a mine-free future. And lastly, we would like to very much thank Canada for sponsoring this event. I'll mention just a couple of brief housekeeping notes for everybody's information. We've set up the discussion as a round of questions to our panelists, whom I will introduce one by one. Following opening remarks, I will open up the round of questions, and then at the end of the event, we'll open the floor for any questions. With that said, it's a pleasure to turn the floor over to our esteemed guests, and I would offer the floor first to the representative from Canada. So please, Thomas, welcome and thank you.
Thank you very much, and I wish everyone a good afternoon. Thanks in particular to the International Campaign to Ban Landmines for organizing this panel discussion. 25 years ago, on the 3rd of December, the Ottawa Convention was signed, and that is a very special date for Canada, and of course for many other states and for civil society in particular, who have worked together with us in embarking on this road and making this a reality. The treaty entered into force in March 1999, and not long thereafter I joined the Canadian Foreign Ministry. So I joined the Canadian Foreign Ministry at a time when landmines was indeed on its road, but very much in the minds of Canadians, very much in my mind as well. So as I said, the Ottawa Treaty is very special to Canadians and personally to myself, but I'm sure also special to many others. And we very much appreciate the collaboration that we received from Austria, Norway, many other countries. And of course, as I said, it couldn't have been done without civil society. And this theme of inclusion is, of course, very important for Canada. That's why we call for the inclusion of women and youth and other diverse voices in all disarmament that we do, because we believe the more diverse voices we have in the room, the better the outcomes will be. So, of course, the Landmine Treaty is important for us because it made a real difference in the lives of people. Many, many lives were saved by banning landmines. And as was noted, it also created a different pathway for moving forward on some disarmament issues. Of course, the Cluster Munitions Convention came afterwards and was somewhat modeled on the Ottawa process. And Arms Trade Treaty and other disarmament efforts came later. So we are very proud of the Landmines Treaty in and of itself, as well as the process that we introduced for tackling some urgent disarmament issues. But of course, much more remains to be done. There are roughly 33 countries, based on my latest reading, that have not yet joined the Landmines, the Anti-Personnel Mines Treaty. And of course, we need to work on those states because many of them are important landmines producers. And the job is only done when we have all states on board, once we have achieved universalization, once all the stocks have disappeared, and once all the survivors who need our help have been helped. So much remains to be done, but we are grateful for everyone's contribution to this important effort, and Canada remains determined to continue its work on this important treaty and in seeking its implementation. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I would like to pass the floor to Ambassador Quintero from Colombia.
Yes, already? No. Yes. Thank you. Thank you very much. Ambassador Thomas Betts, Deputy Permanent Representative to Canada, of Canada to the Conference of Disarmament. Ambassador Thomas Goebel, Permanent Representative of Germany to the Conference of Disarmament. Mr. Juan Carlos Ruan, Director of the Mine Ban Treaty Implementation Unit. Distinguished delegates, of diplomatic missions, distinguished representatives of the ICBL, and other non-governmental organizations, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to thank the Canadian mission and the International Campaign to Ban Landmines for inviting me to participate in and support this important event on behalf of the presidency of the 20th meeting of States Parties to the Mine Ban Convention, held by Colombia through Ambassador Álvaro Enrique Ayala in Geneva, who was unable to join us. 25 years have passed since the adoption and signing of the convention, and this commemoration is a special occasion to remember the significance of this civil society initiative that achieved the necessary momentum to accomplish the prohibition of this type of weapons through an international treaty. However, it is also an opportunity to reflect on why the number of landmine victims in the world today continues to grow. What must we do better to achieve a world free of landmines? Whatever the answer to these two questions, it leads us to contemplate a critical reality. In 2020, the number of annual casualties was 7,073, which is more than double the number of casualties recorded in 2013. Most of these victims occur in countries with armed conflicts. The Anti-Personal Mine Ban Convention is the cornerstone of the international effort to end the suffering and casualties caused by anti-personal mines. Unfortunately, the convention sometimes seems more relevant than ever. With conflicts erupting around the world and improvised mines being the weapon of choice for armed non-state actors. And that is why we want it to be strengthened and made universal. In that sense, this is an open invitation to those states that have not yet acceded it to join and ratify the convention. On its 25th anniversary, it is essential that we work together to strengthen its implementation and renew our commitment to rid the world of these barbaric weapons. This will require a joint effort and the cooperation and assistance of the international community. As we reach the 25-year mark of the adoption of the Convention, and as we reach the midpoint of the implementation of the Oslo Plan of Action adopted by the States Parties at the 4th Review Conference in 2019, we have the opportunity to intensify our efforts to achieve the goal we set out many years ago. This is also a call to all actors, state and non-state, who continue to use anti-personal mines to stop their use, to realize the importance to stop landmines because they have sown death, distress, and desolation. Anti-personal mines should never have existed and must no longer exist. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Now I'd like to turn the floor over to Ambassador Goebel from Germany, and I will take the opportunity to say thank you in advance, as I know you may have to step out of the discussion early. So the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for giving the floor, and good afternoon to Excellencies, colleagues, dear participants. Now it's a pleasure to be with you, but indeed I will have to leave earlier. But first of all, I would like to thank ICBL for organizing this important event, and also I would like to thank Canada for sponsoring today's gathering. And as we've just heard, I think Canada is a champion of the anti-personal mine ban convention, and it's not by incident that it's well known under the name of the Ottawa Convention. And I think this Ottawa Convention is and remains certainly a ground-breaking disarmament treaty and a cornerstone of international humanitarian law. because I think through the convention we express our shared goal of a world free of anti-personal landmines. But the convention has also been and still is a shining example of cooperation between civil society, as ICBL inter alia, and governments to render agreements in the area of humanitarian armed conflict more effective. So I think this side event marking the 25th anniversary of the APMC treaty provides certainly a very welcome occasion to reflect on what the convention has achieved so far and what is still before us. And it calls certainly in this regard also to reflect on the challenges we need to address in the years to come. As we've just heard, I think impressive progress has certainly been made concerning the clearance of landmines. However, the level of ambition concerning concrete implementation steps needs to remain high. On a global level, hard work still lies ahead in order to achieve a mine-free world. Also, and this was also already pointed out, we have not yet achieved the full universalization of the convention. With 164 states parties, I think we have certainly come a long way, and this is an impressive number. But we certainly need to further increase our efforts individually, but also collectively, to finally get the remaining states on board and to further increase the stigmatization of the use of these inhuman weapons. And in this regard, unfortunately, we are actually just witnessing another clear step backwards. I'm referring to the Russian war of aggression in Ukraine, and I think we have seen that the use of anti-personnel landmines in this conflict, and this is something which we strongly condemn, and I think that cannot go without a clear follow-up, and this cannot be accepted without impunity. So Germany will continue its programs to support Ukraine, but also other states in mine clearance, support of coordination mechanisms via UNDP, as well as victim assistance and rehabilitation. And just want to underline that Germany fully fulfills its obligation under the convention, but Germany also, and this is I think very important, recognizes its overall responsibility to support state parties in their efforts to clear landmines, as well as to support victims. And only in 2021, Germany has provided around 55 million euro in assistance for clearance of mines, but also cluster munitions and other explosive remnants of war, victim assistance and risk awareness activities. We are running projects currently in Afghanistan, Ukraine, Bosnia-Herzegovina, also in Colombia, and to name just a few of them. Germany tries to put the emphasis on innovative solutions in doing so, including technical innovations such as the use of drones for surveys or digital training courses. Another focus lies on inclusive, conflict-sensitive approaches, as well as projects that, through humanitarian mine action, contribute to the humanitarian development peace nexus, covering peace, reconciliation, stability, and sustainable development. So, for example, in Colombia, our work is strongly linked to the peace and reconciliation process. In Somalia, our mine action work also in support of the stability in the country and indeed in the whole region through a cross-border approach to Ethiopia as well. So Germany also firmly supports in all these projects and all these undertakings the mainstreaming of a gender perspective into the mine action we are supporting. So what I tried to just present to you in a nutshell was that in the past decades, Germany has been and will continue to be a staunch supporter of the Ottawa Convention in its ambition to achieve a mine-free world and to leave no one behind, as is the title of this event. And it's exactly for this reason, building on our engagement and in order to further support the implementation of the Ottawa Convention, Germany is ready, if I may say, and hopes to take over the presidency of the 21st meeting of states parties of the Convention, taking place in November 2023. And we are looking forward to working together with you and all stakeholders and are currently in a process of fine-tuning our priorities, which we certainly will share with you once they are ready. But as for now, we are looking forward to the 20th meeting of state parties under the able leadership of Colombia, which we recommend for all its efforts, and we certainly hope that we will be able to carry on all your work. Anyway, we're standing ready for that, and with this, I wish you all a very interesting and fruitful discussion this afternoon. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and thanks for all of the opening remarks. I think on that note, I am hearing much discussion of support for partnerships, for inclusion, and for looking at a comprehensive approach to mine action and to our work. I think that's a perfect introduction, thanks again to all, to our speakers and to the information that they're going to share with us. I'd like to first turn the floor over to Juan Carlos Ruan, who is Director of the Mine Ban Treaty Implementation Support Unit, and with a simple question, simply, Juan Carlos, can you give concrete examples of how the Mine Ban Treaty has saved lives and has supported impacted communities during its lifetime? Thank you.
Well, thank you very much to Canada and the ICBL. Ladies and gentlemen, 15,000 to 20,000 casualties were being registered in 1999. And I say registered because we don't know how many went unregistered. Most recently down to 3,000 in 2013, which was the lowest number we've achieved, and up to 8,000, approximately 8,000 in the last 2 years, which is really far too many people injured by a weapon that 164 states have decided has no place in today's world. But a marked reduction from earlier years. Now, states parties have, in the most cases, seen a reduction of casualties in from anti-personnel mines. Now, the global figures are higher due to certain states that have ongoing conflicts. But in most cases, it has reduced significantly, with some countries reporting zero casualties, and that's a goal that everyone should attain to, is zero casualties. Much of this is due to the convention's entry into force in 1999. And the norm established by the treaty has been extremely important. No state today, at least not legally, transfers anti-personnel mines. Less than a handful of states are placing new mines, and most states not parties, many of them, are implementing provisions of the treaty and abiding by the prohibitions, and that's something that we all need to push these states not parties to do. More than 53 million stockpiled mines have been collectively destroyed by states parties, and this means that there's 53 mines that won't be lodged in the ground waiting for a victim. hundreds of millions, if not billions, of square meters have been addressed, removing the barriers, the threat or perceived threat of anti-personnel mines in communities, and returning this land to productive use of the community. So we have made commendable progress as well in delivering on the promise of the convention to provide support to mine survivors and victims. And today we have a better understanding of what that will take, not only to support, but to ensure their social and economic reintegration and inclusion into society. So in this sense, the convention has had a real impact, life-saving impact, and has empowered mine-affected communities. I was thinking about this question last night, because you can imagine, as a good moderator, I got these questions ahead of time. And it was difficult to think of more examples. Not difficult because there are no concrete examples, but difficult, quite the opposite. There are too many concrete examples of what the convention has done to save lives and empowered communities. I mean, we have seen the contribution it makes as a confidence and security building measure between states with contamination on common borders, between states and armed non-state actors in support of peace processes, the liberation of communities from this vestige of war that's been there for 50 years, and they've had to contend with living with this threat and carrying on their daily activities, whether that's walking to school or whether that is going to fetch water and having to navigate mined areas, something that many of us have never had to contend with. So it is, I think, important to recall that the convention, it not just saves lives, it's a humanitarian disarmament treaty. And it's not a matter just of disarmament, but it's also a matter of development, human rights, health, humanitarian support, environmental support, and also of good governance to ensure that the well-being of communities. And in this sense, it has, as I mentioned, indeed saved lives. And I'd be very concerned to think where we would be today without the anti-personnel mine ban treaty. I don't think the situation will be as pretty in terms of the anti-personnel mine casualty figures. But I will say that that should not cloud us in thinking that there's no challenges. And I think that's something that we'll get into a bit later on this panel. So I'll leave those introductory remarks like that. Thank you.
Thank you, Juan Carlos. This conversation would be remiss if we didn't have voices that Juan Carlos has just mentioned of survivors themselves. We're extremely pleased to be able to invite to join us today Hussein Ahmadi, who is Executive Director of the Afghan Landmine Survivors Organization. Hopefully this will go without hitch. He's joining us from Kabul, Afghanistan. Can we get Hussein on the screen? I will turn the floor over to Hussein as soon as he's able to join us. ICBL, as you know, is a coalition of organizations in over 100 countries. The Afghan Landmine Survivors Organization is one extremely important, but one of several survivor organizations that participate, contribute to the work that we do. Hussein, can you hear us?
Yes.
Wonderful to have you with us, Hussein. It looks like we may not get your image, but if you can hear us, I'll go ahead.
Yes, thank you. Hello and good afternoon, all. Thank you
Hussein?
so much to ICBL for... Yes.
Good.
I can hear.
Wonderful. I'm just confirming we can see and hear you fine. And the floor is yours. I will simply offer a question, and that is if you could maybe share with us a bit about how the Mine Ban Treaty has impacted assistance to victims in Afghanistan. So welcome and thank you.
Thank you again. Thanks to the ICBL for inviting the Afghan Landmine Survivors Organization also, and Canada Mission for sponsoring to participate in this important side event. I am honored to speak on behalf of also from Kabul, Afghanistan. Also as a national NGO, it is a network of survivors and a representative organization of persons with disability active since 2007 in Afghanistan. As I see and think, in many ways, the Mine Ban Treaty brought about positive change to landmine victims in Afghanistan. First of all, it provided safety to those victims, such as affected communities, not to further affected by presence of landmines, namely clearance and destruction of landmines. Secondly, the Mine Ban Treaty was the first international law that provided to Afghan victims a legal framework in which their needs and to some extent their rights were acknowledged. Victim assistance under Mine Ban Treaty helped with creating a broader disability rights movement. Tens of small to large projects were implemented through WAA but reached people with disabilities before Afghanistan became a member of the UNCRPD. Organizations like the one I have the honor to lead and represent today, the Afghan Landmine Survivors Organization, hired and supported by VA, a significant of which is associated to Mine Ban Treaty. This local organization, alongside with international organizations, have played critical roles in the past 2 decades. For example, since its establishment of also in 2007, also achieved the followings. First, more than 4,000 of landmine survivors and persons with disability provided peer-to-peer and psychosocial support. 2, more than 5,000 mine survivors and persons with disabilities provided socioeconomic support such as employment, vocational training, and capacity building. More than 1,000 public places like schools, public hospitals, parks, and other public places were made physical accessibility to mine survivors and persons with disabilities. And more than 1 million people received awareness about rights of mine survivors and persons with disabilities in Afghanistan, in the southern and remote areas of Afghanistan, with support of different our international community supporters. This is just to name a few. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our next guest is Natalia Morales, who is the Director of Gender from the Colombian Campaign to Ban Landmines, and she is joining us from Colombia. We'll give her 1 minute to come on screen. Natalia is going to share with us a bit about the Colombian campaign experience in the context of mine action and linkages to peace building. Natalia?
Hello.
Hi, Natalia. Wonderful to see you. Can you hear us fine?
Yeah, perfect.
Okay. I'll just then introduce you again. Natalia Morales, Director of Gender for the Colombia Campaign to Ban Landmines. Natalia, very happy you can join us. And can you give us a brief picture of your work with, or the work of the Colombian campaign and the connection of mine action and peace building? The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much for inviting us and to Canada for sponsoring this event. I'm going to do, as you said, a link between demining and the peace building, and a little bit of an example of the work that the Colombian campaign has been doing. So the Colombian campaign to ban landmine as a local organization has a commitment and a mission that goes beyond clearance the mines that we have in Colombia. Our mission is a little bit related to the development of the communities and the construction of peace by avoiding the human suffering. And based on this, the CCBL has always considered and advocate for mine action to be a peace building mechanism, and has been involved in all advocacy process at the local and international levels to make it so. So Colombia, I think we have a unique case study as we recently went through a peace process that resulted in one of the most widely studied ones. In it, mine action is recognized as a cross-cutting theme in broad discussions as land reform, victims representation, and perhaps most relevant to the conference, a way to reintegrate former combats to civil life. Yet mine action role in the process and its current implementation was not isolated development. Rather, it was a concerted effort from civil society and international guarantors to advocate for its inclusion as a major part in the entire process. The advocacy efforts even result in two trust building exercises between then active FARC combats and the Colombian army. In these exercises, two communities that were highly contaminated were chosen in the municipalities of Briseño and Vistahermosa, and mixed teams from both sides developed a manual clearing process. That exercise not only served as a way to bridge positions of the two parties at the point where negotiations were stalled, and it became the base of Humanicemos TH, who is a mine action organization formed by ex-combat so that they could have stable income throughout their transit to civil life. And they are currently doing demining operations here in Colombia. The creation of Humanicemos was an initiative that involved the entire mine action sector in Colombia, as different organizations took in groups of ex-combat to train them and later deploy them back to Humanicemos. That is a really important process factor also to prevent relapsing into different violent cycles, which unfortunately has been the case for a minority of ex-combats in Colombia, because that way they have a stable income on that first period of reintegration into civilian life. We as CCBL were part of this process in doing advocacy at the moment when the peace process was being developed, and also we took in a group of Humanicemos in our operations in Algeciras. Algeciras was a municipality that had been controlled at the time by the FARC guerrilla in the hardest years of the conflict. And while challenging the process with the ex-combat in Algeciras, as CCBL conducted risk education sessions and perception surveys before the personnel could be transferred to Humanicemos. And later on, when we finished our intervention in that municipality and conduct surveys and focal groups to determine the overall perception of the process that we did on the community. One of the topics that came up constantly was the inclusion of ex-combats in our teams and how it had helped turn around the public opinion in a municipality that has suffered so much in the hands of the former guerrilla. So this is something now Humanicemos is a fully autonomous organization operating in the country and continues to experience in the communities that they intervene in. There are at least mine action perception as a neutral exercise is used to promote reconciliations since communities agreed that freeing land from explosive ordnance contamination is more important than all wounds, no matter how deep they run, and that they also help heal those wounds that our country and our communities have. In addition to this, the CCBL has also wanted to make it work space a reflection of what we hope to build in our society and our communities, which is why we understand that mine action, as in all humanitarian sectors, there is a space to carry out transformative action initiatives in relation to gender and diversity that create a positive impact on the peace building. Our organization is a diverse one. Where we have men, we have women, we have people from the LGBTIQ plus community, we have ex-combats from diverse groups, we have ethnic communities and people from different regions of the country within our workspace that we work every day to make it inclusive and free of violence. Throughout the example of our organization and the presence of this diverse group that represent us in the communities and work in these communities, it has been shown that living in peace and working together to change the reality of our territory, of our country, it's possible. As with the example of the ex-combat, this seeks to provide opportunities for social economic inclusion to historically excluded groups who, having opportunities, becomes agents of change, contribute to the construction of peace, as well as to the change of public perception in relation to this population group. So from our experience as a country and also from our experience as a demining humanitarian demining operation, we we think that the connection between peace building and humanitarian demining is clear, and we invite every country and every operator to seek for that connection and hopefully use humanitarian mine action activities in general to construct peace and to include diverse groups.
Thank you, Natalia. Looking at the connection, as you said, of peace building and mine action, looking for synergies, these points actually have figured also for the work of another of our members, and this is Geneva Call. With that said, I'd like to introduce Speaker Ezekiel Jefe, who is the Senior Policy and Legal Advisor for Geneva Call. And I'd like to invite you, Ezekiel, to just tell us a bit more about the genesis of Geneva Call in relation to the Mine Ban Treaty on some of these themes we're discussing.
Thank you very much, ICBL and Canada, for the invitation to speak today. This is a topic that goes to the core of Geneva Call. Geneva Call is a humanitarian organization that engages armed groups and de facto authorities around the world on different humanitarian norms. And the first norm that Geneva Code started engaging these groups on was on the prohibition of using landmines. Geneva Code actually was created exclusively to engage armed groups around the world on this prohibition. And the reason was because the Ottawa Convention, as you know, only allows states to ratify, because this is an international treaty. So the founders of Geneva Code, they decided to create this parallel system through which armed groups could engage with to the core obligations of the treaties. And through this engagement, this engagement is also monitored by an external actor, in this case is Geneva Code. So at the time, Geneva Code was actually created by former members of ICBL, and they created towards this goal, and they developed what we call, it is a deed of commitment. It's a sort of unilateral declaration that Geneva Code uses around the world to engage armed groups on the prohibition of landmines. And more than 50 groups from different places have signed this deed of commitment. They have committed to stop the use of anti-personnel mines, and they have allowed Geneva Code to monitor the respect of those obligations. Groups from the Philippines, from Myanmar, from Sudan, from Syria, they have all committed through the signing of these deeds to stop the use of anti-personnel mines, to destroy their stockpile of anti-personnel mines, to allow external organizations such as Geneva Code to monitor the respect of these commitments, but also, importantly, they have allowed humanitarian actors to access the territories they control to treat individuals who have been victims of landmines in the territories. So Geneva Code, again, in its foundation, it was mostly to address this issue. Nowadays, it has changed because what actually happened is that in the first 5-6 years of experience, Geneva Code was engaging 50-60 groups around the world in the prohibition of landmines. Because let's face it, armed groups actually use anti-personnel mines around the world. So what actually happened is we were talking to these groups about the prohibition of landmines, but these groups were also responsible for affecting other humanitarian norms, using and recruiting children in hostilities, gender discrimination and sexual violence, healthcare, cultural heritage, international humanitarian law in general. So although Geneva Code started in the first 10 years to focus exclusively on this issue, nowadays we have expanded to deal with other humanitarian concerns that exist around the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Our last speaker in the first round of question is my colleague, Marion Lodeau, the Landmine and Cluster Munition Monitor editorial manager. And the question that I would pose to you, Marion, is, or invitation, would be to give us a picture of what mine support, sort of concretely speaking, what mine support has looked like for mine action, over the past 25 years. The floor is yours.
Thanks, Jared, and thanks much to Canada for sponsoring that very important discussion today. And good afternoon and hello to those joining us online. Just briefly, I'm going to start with the Landmine and Cluster Munition Monitor briefly. It was created right after the adoption of the treaty, of the Mine Ban Treaty, with the idea that we needed data to ensure the obligations under the treaty were implemented, and also to have a sort of a reference to see where are the gaps and what are the progress being made. So that this is the story behind the monitor, really to provide that knowledge so that we can make sure we know what we are doing and if we are doing the things right. Part of the research that we are doing at the Landmine and Cluster Munition Monitor is support for mine action. And what we mean by that is that we are looking at international support, how much money international donors are providing to activities related to mine action. So that could be clearance, risk education, victim assistance, stockpile destruction, advocacy work, as well as capacity building. So we're looking at all those sectors and how much money is being allocated to those activities. Then we are also looking at national support for mine action. And this means how much money affected states are providing to their own mine action program. So you have those two aspects. Once you know that, you also need to keep in mind that the idea at the beginning, when we created that treaty 25 years ago, it was to ensure that the consequences of the use of those weapons would not only be a burden for the affected states, because this was not only, up to them to clear land, to ensure that population would be safe and could use the land again. You had really that feeling that it was a shared responsibility, and this is really at the core of the treaty. You have the Article 6 of the Mine Ban Treaty on international cooperation and assistance that recognize the right of each state party to receive assistance to ensure that they can clear land and provide adequate support to the victims throughout their lives. And it has worked pretty well. Based on the monitor data, what we know is that since the adoption of the treaty, at least, and I'm saying at least because, it's always about what is being reported, and at the early beginnings of the treaty, states and donors were not reporting the same way. So it is really at least 12 billion were provided to support for mine action. So it is impressive. It is really a demonstration of the strong spirit of solidarity and of shared responsibility that has been built over the years. And when we look in details, most of that funding is provided by international donors. About 80% each year is from international donors, and the rest is from national support, so from mine-affected states to their own mine action program. So I think this is something to keep in mind, really. When we talk about support for mine action, it is mostly donors, international donors. And if we look at the past 10 years, if we look at states party support, they contributed to 50%. So half of the support of the international support is from states parties, which means that the rest of the support is provided by non-state party. And I believe that's also important to keep that in mind, that the treaty has been so successful in a way that even states that are not yet party to the treaty do see the need to provide mine action support. And the best example of that is the United States, which is the main donor of mine action since 1997. So yeah, I think really that gives more or less a clear picture around support for mine action.
Thank you. We're going to jump right into the second round of questions, which is really focusing on some of the challenges. I mean, some of them have already been mentioned that we're looking at in terms of addressing the scourge of landmines in IEDs. I won't offer further comment at this point because I'd like to hear from, again, from the panelists. I'm going to turn the floor back to Marion because I think the picture you just painted is very nice and clear, even maybe rosy. And then, of course, we need to look at here today sort of what challenges the monitor as a monitoring body is seeing in terms of support going forward and what's happening today to the great success that we've seen thus far. So, Marion, please kick us off.
Thanks. So, smooth transition. So, as I said, international support is the main source of money and resources to implement the treaty. And what we've seen recently is that we had a peak in 2017, and since we reached that peak, we've been going down and down and down. So, it is really clear and apparent that support for mine action is decreasing. You have two aspects for that. You have first mine-affected states. They are facing more and more challenges in allocating national resources to conduct their own mine action programs, and this is something we keep hearing at at meetings of states parties, that they don't have the capacity to provide more national resources to do the job. And then we also know that international donors are confronted with more and more crises to respond to. So we already had a complex picture, and it's now even more complex because we have more crises happening. We had the COVID-19 pandemic. We are right now in the middle of a major crisis with the conflict in Ukraine. And it's not to mention all the other conflicts happening all around the world, as well as the climate crisis. So all that is putting more and more pressure on budgets and the resources available. So it's complicated because you have increasing needs and you have less resources. So you need to find a way to sort of find the best solution to adjust to that. The thing that is extremely concerning, though, is that human security now, because of that context, risk to being no longer the priority because you have more demands for other expenditures. And a very, I think, striking and clear example of that is military spending. It had reached a new peak of 2 trillion in 2021. So if we're going back quickly to the first number I gave you, which was 12 billion in the past 25 years, and if we just take a moment to make a comparison of those two figures, 12 billion in 25 years and 2 trillion in 1 year, I think there's something to be understood, and are we really serious about leaving no one behind? That is really, I think, the question we can ask ourselves there. And briefly, because I don't want to speak for too long, I know we have a tight schedule, but this is just the tip of the iceberg, really. Because then if you look at the different trends in support for mine action, what we see is that year after year, you have the same donors providing most of the money. So it means that mine action is really dependent on those 5 to 10 donors, and if those donors are changing their budget allocation, then we will have a real issue with being able to continue mine action work, because this is what it means. You have to go above the numbers. If mine action support is decreasing, it means no activities on the ground, no clearance, no risk education, and no assistance to victims. Another thing to look at is that most of the money is going to the same group of recipient states, of affected states. And when we look at the past 10 years, you have, for the largest 10 recipients of mine action, that group was only composed of 15 different countries. And if you compare that to the 60 mine-affected states and territories, it means that many of them are left behind and do not receive adequate support. And lastly, the last information I wanted to share was about the sectors that are receiving the money. And most of mine action support is going to clearance activities. Again, it is the same trend year after year. What it means is that risk education, victim assistance, capacity building do not receive enough support to answer to all the different aspects covered by the Mine Ban Treaty. So in a nutshell, what I believe needs more work is greater coordination among donors to ensure that there is this discussion happening and that we can cover a wider range of recipient states, that those that have a small contamination can also receive support they need so that they can join the over than 30 states that are now cleared from landmines. We also need to address the gap in national capacities, and this means more investment in capacity building. If you make sure that the national authorities have the capacity to conduct the work over the long run, not only for a year, but over a long run, because we're not talking only about clearing, but we're also talking about assisting victims and affected communities throughout their life. So I think this is a very important aspect to keep in mind. And lastly, expanding synergies with other sectors. It was briefly mentioned by the ambassador of Germany earlier in his remarks, but I think this is something that we need to push further. It's not new, it's not a new topic that clearance and victim assistance or mine action in general is really linked to development, environment, human rights, disability rights, and so on. The list really goes on. But I think now is the time to really expand those synergies, those links, to ensure that we can have more resources to simply stop leaving people behind and achieve a mine-free world. And I stop there.
Thank you. I'd like to go back to you, Juan Carlos, and I'm going to pitch you maybe a couple of challenging questions. I'm sure you're up to it. It's two-part. The first question is, looking at the success of the Mine Ban Treaty over the past 25 years, there's a high bar there to be met, it seems. What are the principal challenges today, from your perspective, to ensuring this level of implementation success continues? The second question, or related question, is when we think about 2025, which is in 2 years now, and the aspirational target of a mine-free 2025, there's clearly a focus on clearance. As we get closer to that milestone, it seems like we may need a new framework that looks at some of the issues that have just been mentioned here by many of the speakers in terms of human security, in terms of development, et cetera. What does this mean for treaty implementation in your eyes going forward? So thank you much.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jared. So the convention, as mentioned, has indeed set the bar high, and perhaps it's a danger, and we need to be careful not to become a victim of our own success, which could mask the tremendous challenges that we have going forward. The question is perhaps not how we keep that bar, but how we collectively intensify implementation to drive the bar higher. I think as a community of the convention, we do need to bring back a bit of that excitement and high-level attention that the treaty enjoyed during its first years and the adoption and the entry into force of the treaty. Getting to the adoption and the entry into force was hard work by many, and intensifying implementation will take that kind of individual energy to bring it back. And challenges do abound. We have several challenges. It's quite tricky to speak about global challenges because of the specific context that states find themselves in and the specific threats they face. But there are a number of challenges that seem to be global that I'd like to share with you. First and critically is national and international political will for the convention's implementation. That could be strengthened. And raising the priority of the convention implementation nationally and internationally is critical, and with many of the challenges we face may dissipate. And it's more important than ever, given that we have an increase in the number of casualties during the years. There has been, as mentioned, a bit of a slow progress on universalization in the last years, and we do need to get those 33 states that were mentioned earlier on board as soon as possible. It will take, of course, time, it takes coordination, and it takes real engagement. And the convention, together with the president and the states parties, as well as other tools, such as the special envoys of the convention, Her Royal Highness Princess Astrid of Belgium and His Royal Highness Prince Mirid of Jordan, are there to support the cause. States parties have also indicated a number of matters that are preventing or impeding efforts, including security concerns, the new use of improvised explosive devices, many of which are anti-personnel mines by their definition. And I do take this opportunity to remind states that are affected by these weapons to address these weapons within the framework of the convention. Another significant factor that's been highlighted by states has been, as was just mentioned by my ICBL colleague, is the limited financial and international resources for treaty implementation. Now, there does need to be support to the states that are on the road to completing implementation in the near term. For this, a lot of states can complete by 2025 or shortly thereafter. And we know that the last mile, if you've ever run a marathon, the last mile is the hardest to run. And that often needs a lot of coordination and support to be able to push them across the finish line. And we need successes under the convention, and we need to be able to celebrate these new successes. Success breeds success, as they say. We're also need to address real deficiencies that we have in treaty implementation when it comes to reporting. Reporting rates are very low, including on retained mines, on the implementation of national implementation measures. As you know, reporting is a critical part of this convention. And finally, I think there is an outstanding debt to survivors and victims of anti-personnel mines, and who require more support in being able to access services to support their socioeconomic reintegration. Now, these are all areas that need to be improved. Concerning 2025, it is an important aspirational target that was established by the states parties. But however, we have to remember that the 2025 date was not to conclude implementation, but was to complete to the furthest extent possible implementation. It was a goal to push towards the end result. Personally, I do feel that we need to not miss the opportunity to highlight how successful we have actually been. I guess it would mask it if we hold ourselves, the only litmus test for success is completion. This removes all other measurements that should highlight our success. For example, with states parties, if by 2025 states parties are jointly addressing border areas where today it stands as a barrier due to political issues, if all states have adopted methodologies that ensure they're well placed to complete in the near future, if we see a reduction in casualty rates in states implementing the convention, if they have established national mine action platforms to engage in that regular dialogue with all partners, if they do, as Marianne was mentioning, link mine action to other frameworks such as development, disability, humanitarian response plans, etc., as requested by the Oslo Action Plan that the states are implementing, if we see an increase in national and international funding, or in some cases a more equitable distribution to those states with limited contamination and that have solid plans for completion. In this sense, I think we do need to be careful in what we're measuring as success when we come to 2025, because we will have successes. It may not be completion, but we shouldn't be too hard on ourselves because there has been success. The Oslo Action Plan that the states parties are implementing at the moment, that was adopted at the third review conference, it holds a lot of the best practices that if implemented will ensure that we arrive at 2025 and we can look back proudly on the joint success that we've achieved. But indeed, it does need to be intensified. We do need to intensify our actions going forward in the next 2 years of implementation. And none of these challenges are insurmountable. You know, we saw how quickly the community, states, parties, and civil society got together to continue our efforts even during the COVID pandemic when a lot of other efforts kind of stopped. So I think they're not insurmountable, and in the next 2 years will be very telling. About the new kind of shift, as Marianne mentioned earlier as well, it's not new, this linking mine action to other frameworks. We did it with the MDGs. We've been doing it with the SDGs. And the Oslo Action Plan requests states to do just that, to integrate mine action into broader frameworks such as development and emergency response and other frameworks. And a lot of countries that are supporters of mine action have also indicated that to states that are affected, to integrate mine action into development plans so that funding can more easily flow to these countries. So I think we do have a good idea about what we have to do to ensure mine action is not siloed in a mine action, but actually has it needs to be mainstreamed into a lot of other frameworks. So thank you.
Thank you. Juan Carlos, you mentioned, challenges are, there are some global challenges and there's some unique challenges based on the country situations, our regional situations. With that said, I'd like to turn the floor back to our colleague, Natalia, from the Colombian campaign, and to look at some of the work that they have been doing in Iraq and Syria. And Natalia, specifically, looking at some of the mine action and peace building work that the campaign has carried out in Colombia and your success there, how are those challenges different on these new programs that you're setting up? And with that, what do you see as necessary to replicate the success that you talked about in Colombia, to taking that model and using it elsewhere, mine action as a tool for peace building? So the floor is yours, please.
Thank you. Well, regarding your first question, as you mentioned, the CCBL has started a capacity building project with local organizations, two in Iraq and one in Syria. Although it's still a process that we are starting and it's under construction and development, we have been able to identify common points that led us to want to support the process in this country after the experience that we had here in Colombia when we started our process of humanitarian demining. Um, some of that common points such as the fact that there are countries highly affected by the presence of explosive devices, with a need that organizations and local authorities appropriate of the process of mine action in their countries. These countries, like Colombia, in its time, need more support and resources to strengthen local organizations and to see in their work an opportunity to rebuild social relationships throughout the joint work of diverse populations for a common goal, in this case, well, demining. On the other hand, we have also identified four main difference challenges for the development of our work in these countries. First is the land and the type of contamination, because in these territories there is a lot of industrial contaminations, and in Colombia it's mostly improvised. Although these represent a point in which we can support from our expertise, taking into account that improvised contamination that exists in these countries, and the technical experience that we have in it. Second, we think that local organizations are not the protagonists in the demining process of these countries. The same thing was happening here in Colombia, and we know that happening in other countries. So we understand that strengthening processes is necessary, but it will also have its challenges when thinking about the sustainability of these processes, a situation similar to the one that we have here in Colombia. And it has a little bit to do with the things that some of the things that Marion said on her intervention about the allocation of resources, the importance of doing it to local organizations, and also not letting anyone behind. It's important to allocate resources to risk education and to victim assistance. That is a point of departure for the humanitarian demining activities on places that not necessary we can do clearance at the point, and victim assistance and risk education can be done. Also in Syria, in the part that we are going to work, that is NES, the National Authority of the Mine Action and its procedures are still in the process of consolidation, and they are on the right track, but there is still a lot of work to be done, representing a challenge back to work there, but also an opportunity for jointly construction with local authorities and organizations, as well as a process of strengthening all of the sector. And finally, the diversity in both countries represent a challenge for us when thinking about victim assistance and risk education approach for the activities. A situation that we also face here in Colombia due to the cultural diversity in our own country. So if we analyze the points in common and the difference and challenges, we can realize that they are all intertwined, and that from the expertise we have acquired with our work And that expertise of the organizations with which we are going to work there, from their territory, their processes, and their realities, all challenges become opportunities for support, strengthening, and growth. But of course, we need the support of all the sector and donors, especially for that and for the sustainability of our idea program of local organizations being the ones doing the clearance in their own countries. And about the second question that you said, so what is needed to replicate the achieves that we managed to have in Colombia as a country, as an organization. From the CCBL, we think that some of the key points we want to highlight in the Colombian case that are conductive to outcomes that we are seeing in Colombia are a significant political will is needed for mine action to transcend from humanitarian action and actually contribute to positive outcomes in development and especially in peace building. That political will might not be there at first or might not be sustained over time given different swings in political context, but the entire sector must strongly advocate for it as the potential is there, but we must always aim for it. Second, strong coordination mechanisms are needed, both in contexts where there are properly functioning states, in which case mine action needs to be part of broader strategies with public policies in place, and also in contexts where states might not have the same capacities. So the sector and the international cooperation stakeholders at large must strive to bring that gap to guarantee that mine action is not left to its own, and as we say, no one is left behind, but rather we use effectively as an enabling tool. That is not to say that mine action organizations can and should do everything. Mine action is a part of a broader strategy, and the sector, including operators, donor, and multilateral mechanisms, must avoid isolating the mine action. If mine action would help communities heal after a 60 years of prolonged internal conflict in Colombia, it can help reconciliate communities divided by deeper factors, maybe such as ethnic or religious conflict. Yet the sector must work toward that instead of looking always within the confines of our own work. Finally, as a local created NGO, we believe that local organizations have a crucial part to play in that by having the ability to take ownership of their processes, being able to make the necessary impact in their country and internationally due to the knowledge of the local and for the need and hope from the appropriation to change their own reality. All these recognizing mine action universal role as a prime way to build trust among communities affected by violence and the armed conflict.
Thank you, Natalia. This issue you were just referring to again, the building trust, engagement of the local groups, and helping to reconcile communities after conflict. Great point. Thank you. Just showing the opportunities for that in these other areas where you're working, and with that. I would like to also go back to Geneva Call and Ezekiel and to talk about the evolution of Geneva's calls focus, which you mentioned briefly earlier, in response to new conflicts, and what can we learn from recent Geneva Call experience regarding dialogue with groups, how we're approaching the Mine Ban Treaty, but also broader disarmament objectives going forward. So over to you.
Thank you very much, Jared, for this question. There are a few important points from our side to share. The first one is that nowadays we see an increase in numbers of armed groups operating around the world compared to what we saw at the end of the 90s. Now we see more than 600 groups that present some sort of humanitarian concern for the international community. This means that they have an effect on populations on the ground. We also observe that there are more than 60 million people living in territories controlled exclusively by armed groups and de facto authorities around the world. So in this humanitarian setting, that is the number of armed groups causing a humanitarian concern and the number of people living in the territories controlled by armed groups, is that it becomes almost inevitable to actually have to discuss with these groups issues related to the protection of those individuals in conflict-affected areas. So this is what we have observed in the last 20 years. There is an increasing number of individuals living under their control. There is an increasing number of armed groups existing around the world. The other one is that Geneva Call, as I mentioned before, it was created exclusively to address the issue of the use of anti-personnel mines by armed groups around the world, but the possibility, the doors that this discussion allow us to have with armed groups serve to actually pave the way for having other humanitarian discussions. So although Geneva Call started discussing about the prohibition of using anti-personnel mines with armed groups and de facto authorities, we have expanded our mandate, and now we also discuss about the prohibition of using and recruiting children in hostilities, the protection of education and schools, the protection of cultural heritage, the protection of healthcare, the prohibition of forced displacement, the prohibition of starvation and other food-related security challenges for individuals on the ground, the respect of basic humanitarian norms. All of these thematic areas are thematic areas that we actually address with armed groups around the world. And we have engaged more than 180 groups on one or more of these thematic areas. What we have developed is these deeds of commitment that I mentioned before with respect to landmines. We also have for other thematic areas, healthcare, the prohibition of the protection of children, the prohibition of sexual violence and gender discrimination, the prohibition of starvation. We use these tools to engage armed groups on the ground. We have bilateral discussions. There are a few things that I think are relevant for the topic today. The first one is that in any given society, the circle of people who is aware of the law is very small. The circle of people who is aware of international law is even smaller. The circle of people who is aware of international humanitarian law is even smaller. And who knows the specific provisions of the treaties, you can imagine that it's actually smaller. So when we think about armed groups, this perception that because they are parties to a conflict, they are aware of their international obligations, most of the time, this is not the case. So in order to increase the respect of international law, what we need to do is we need to sit down with these groups and have an open discussion about international law. What are the rules, the minimum standards that the international community has created to protect individuals on the ground? This is what Geneva Call does, not just with respect to the prohibition of using landmines, but also with respect to other humanitarian concerns. The second point, and with this I don't want to take much more of the time that I was given, is to actually understand the root causes of violations. So when we see that an armed group actually uses landmines, or an armed group occupies an abandoned school, or an armed group attacks a hospital, or recruits or uses children in hostilities, it is important for the international community, for the humanitarian community, engage in those groups to understand why those violations take place. And this is actually a context-dependent scenario. So the reasons why this happens might be different in different conflicts. So it's not the same to see, for instance, how the FARC in Colombia behave during its more than 50 years of history than to see other groups that have existed around the world and have and could have been responsible for other violations. So it is quite important to understand the root causes of these violations. to develop a strategy of engagement. If we don't understand why violations are taking place, then actually sitting down with these groups and trying to have a discussion about their level of respect is going to be very difficult. This is what Geneva Call has actually embraced. We tailor discussions according to the context and according to the thematic area that is being affected. My final point is that engagement is possible. Success is actually possible when talking to these groups about humanitarian norms. Armed groups have destroyed their stockpile of anti-personnel mines after discussing with Geneva Call. They have stopped using anti-personnel mines after being engaged. They have released children they had recruited in the battlefield. They have moved their military barracks away from civilians in order to actually prevent that this might be affected. They have adopted internal laws to actually prevent cases of sexual violence and gender discrimination internally. So this is actually possible, but the best possible avenue that we have identified is to have a direct engagement with these groups. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I'd like, for our last intervention, to turn the floor back to Hussein Ahmadi online. So Hussein, if you can join us again on screen. And really these questions that we've been putting out here, the challenges, some of the solutions that have been put forward, I will offer the floor to Hussein in just a moment when he's back up to tell us a bit about how these impact his organization directly, and maybe to offer some words from his perspective. Hussein, can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear.
Okay. We'll give you a second to come back up on screen. Are you able to share your video? If not, we can. Very good. Wonderful to have you back. Hussein, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's fine if you want to have the video off. I will go ahead. Hussein, as the last intervention of the day, I would offer you to share with us what are the key challenges for mine action groups like yours, like the Afghan Landmine Survivors Organization today, and would you be so bold as to maybe offer us some suggestions on what should be top priorities for treaty leadership, but also for all of us in international mine action community? What should be the top priorities in terms of facing new challenges to making sure that this treaty continues to be the success that it's been? So the floor is yours.
Thank you. Regarding first question, as I see, there are two main challenges for survivor organizations like also, and the challenges for mine survivors and persons with disability in Afghanistan. The first organization challenges, I wish I could not say so, but unfortunately, it is incredibly difficult time for organizations like ours. As you know, since the change of government in August 2021, and even about a year before, the humanitarian assistance reduced dramatically. For the past year, we have lost some great organizations that used to good work in VA and promoting the rights of persons with disability. Also has lost all of its substantial projects. Around 20 people used to work with me at also, whereas now we are only a small team, 100-person volunteer. Thanks to the ICBL, CMC, and other friends in the campaign who provided us some assistance, through which we have been able to keep our office and continue to raise the voice of victims and persons with disabilities. But we will have to shut our office in about 2 months from now as we are lacking of support. It is extremely hard for us to do so, as we know how much mine survivors and persons with disabilities need us. But we did everything possible thing we could, and yet left with no option but to close our program. As mine survivors, of course, we will still try over the next 2 months to find a solution and welcome any advice from our audience today as well. On the other hand, advocacy activities are not possible like the past for us. So in this situation, also is concerned about security issues for safety of its staff, and that you are following different cases that human rights defenders and civil society activists have been subjected to violence. Come to the challenges of mine survivors and persons with disability currently. Also, with support of ICBL, conducted an assessment with participation of mine survivors and persons with disability in August 2022 and find out the main challenge of survivors and their access to humanitarian aid in Afghanistan. The assessment's findings show that mine survivors and persons with disabilities have economic problems because the majority of participants said that they have lost their jobs after political change in Afghanistan. Also, they have less access to humanitarian aids. The obstacles are low awareness of community members and problems in the policy of humanitarian aids, that some of the policies are not inclusive. Second, persons with disabilities mine survivors are facing psychological problems due to this difficult situation, mostly girls and women with disabilities. The third problem for persons with disability and mine survivors have less access to education. Recently, the closure of schools, the impact of COVID-19, limited access of persons with disability to education, but the banning of schools above grade 6 is the main problem for girls and women with disabilities right now. Regarding the third question, what would be the top priorities for Mine Ban Treaty leadership as countries like Afghanistan face new challenges in fully treaty implementation? From my perspective, there are 3 top priorities. First, Mine Ban Treaty leadership should continue support humanitarian mine action, but we make sure to support VA as one priority. I think there are still some local capacities to make good use of international assistance to support mine survivors, but soon such capacity would be lost if not assisted. Second, we thank to the UNMAS for its great commitments to Afghanistan and call on UNMAS to not let mine victims behind. Include VA in your efforts. I mean, all humanitarian efforts, especially projects related to mine action, call for our support and expertise. Finally, the international community of mine action should support human rights-based approach victim assistance. This is important as we are going lots of challenges in Afghanistan. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hussein. At this point, I will just make a couple of very brief comments, conscious of the time, and I would like to open the floor very quickly if there are one or two clear and concise questions. First, a couple of just brief thanks and takeaways. Thanks to the participants online. A very big thanks. I know it's not the same, nearly, to call in and provide your participation. So thank you, Hussein. Thank you, Natalia, very much for joining the conversation. Thanks, of course, to our speakers and for those making opening remarks. Some of the brief takeaways in terms of looking at what are we doing to ensure we're serious about not leaving anyone behind. I think a couple of the points Hussein just mentioned in terms of looking at a human rights-based approach to victim assistance, and including VA as a priority in all aspects of mine action, as I'm sure we all intend to do. The visibility efforts that have been mentioned on IHL specifically being key as a decision, as a conversation opener, being a critical piece of this conversation, that mine action actually, or I should say, these other components of mine action are bigger than their individual parts. Engaging all sectors of society in an inclusive manner, being absolutely essential, critical. Really putting an emphasis on the political will necessary to move this juggernaut forward. These are immense challenges, and it will take immense will as well. Resources do matter, particularly how they are allocated. Risk education and victim assistance were mentioned, of course, without diminishing other aspects of mine action. But all of these aspects matter, and they all deserve important attention if we are really serious. And maybe just a last and on a brighter note, reference to Juan Carlos, your remarks that, in fact, this community was, the mine action community was brought together and founded with many quite innovative ideas, the concept of humanitarian disarmament and the partnership between governments and civil society that has proven to be so strong over these 25 years, that these are in fact built into the process. And so I would say thank you for just reminding us that you referred to the Oslo Action Plan and how actually this inclusivity and comprehensive thinking on mine action is actually, we have some of these tools. It's not redesigning the wheel. It's recommitting to use the wheel and to use it together and turn it together, that I think may be the defining point here. That said, again, and I would open the floor if anyone has one or two quick questions. So please, anyone? Any last comments from any of our speakers? Okay. Please go ahead, Ambassador.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, all of you. I just want to remind the meeting that we'll have the meeting of States Parties in November in Geneva, and I just want to invite all of you to have an active participation. And also, I would like to take advantage of the opportunity to recognize and thank the tremendous efforts of the civil society to meet the tremendous efforts of civil society to work towards the disarmament, non-proliferation, and arms control. And the adoption of the convention is an example of the successful partnerships between civil society and states. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to everyone, and have a good day.